But when you say you were the questioner, you always posed questions that you would hope that would cause Brian to think.
Yes, well, I'm interested in improving my own thinking and that of the whole human race, for that matter. But I recognize from the first that when one is in a state of religious high emotion, whether it's ecstatic or fanatical or whatever it might be, reason is essentially powerless. That this has been well established by the whole history of religion, for that matter. And I say that as a Christian myself. But you can only go so far with reason, and then you have to make you have to go out to have lunch or make the leap of faith or whatever.
Right. 12 years, there came a point which you somehow were able to look at it with some objectivity. What was the turning point, the breaking point for you?
Well, there had been many problems throughout the history of the family, as you might suspect, but we always had a belief that we could work it out, that we would continue to be reasonable with each other. We didn't expect perfection out of each other, but we did believe that we had a commitment to always resolving everything and working everything out. The main difficulty we ran into was with the leader and the way he, in my opinion, became drunk with the power that we had given him. You know, we have to take some credit. I think we fed his ego. It's partly the fault of the greater community, but he reached a point where he was no longer reasonable. He wouldn't listen to anyone. It didn't matter if what he decided was best for the whole. What actually mattered was that we all trusted his decision. And when it got to that point, eventually I mustered my courage, partly out of senses of guilt. Actually, I'd put it off way too long, you know, really confronting the issues. When I finally did, I still at that time maintained a hope that it would shock some reality into us as a group, as a people. What it did is it sort of called his bluff in a way, and his reaction to me was extremely negative and violent, and he just basically did not want anyone who would question his authority within the community.
Now, you were in the Love family where this Jim Jones business happened down in, I can't remember, Guyana, I believe it was. What was your reaction to that?
First, you have to understand that we had separated ourselves from access to most of the media. There was one television in a community of 300 people, eventually 2 televisions. Now there's many, but at that time, no newspapers, magazines, or televisions. Very rare thing.
They read nothing but the Bible.
Right. Well, that's one of the key elements, though.
Yeah, it is.
So, what would you say to someone, and I'm sure that this continues, I don't know at what rate comparatively to the 60s or to the 70s, what would you say to parents, Steve?
Well, I think they should familiarize themselves with the whole area, not necessarily by reading my book. There are any number of informative books on the subject. That would be one instructive thing. Secondly, from the time the child is about 3 days old, stay much closer to him. Now, Brian was by no means a child when he entered the Love family. He was, 25 years old, so he was already out in the world, out of the nest, so to speak. But nevertheless, I think that had we perhaps been in more frequent communication, even though adults are not obliged to keep in communication with their parents, that might somehow have made a difference.
How about you, Brian?
My advice would be to stay openly loving and communicating with anybody in one of the communities, because I remember being within the community. If someone treated us judgmentally, closed-mindedly, never even considering that we might be right about certain things, well, then we just wrote them off. They were unreasonable, they didn't count, and they didn't matter. And it was tragic to watch that happen to people's parents.
Your 3 children range in age from 10 to 2. Are we going to have a deprogramming effect on them as well?
Yeah, we're all going through it as a family, and sometimes it's painful, and sometimes it's uncomfortable. The children are sometimes ashamed. They're very glad to be out.
They are.
And they were mad at me for agreeing to come on this television show because they were afraid their kids would find out they used to be in the Love family. They like to have their new names.
Their friends. Yeah.
Well, one thing, you know, kids, anything that gives them the edge, it maybe, they may become very popular for a couple of weeks. Yeah. Do you fear any kind of retribution? I don't know how your exit was.
Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. I have been threatened, and every now and then I'm going, well, talk's cheap, and people do make threats when they're emotionally charged, and there's nothing to it. And then every now and then I swing over and say, don't be ridiculous. It's, something could happen.
Religious fanaticism is dangerous.
Well, we're watching that unfold in the Middle East.
It has been for thousands of years and always will be.
I would like to mention that recently, what was the date of the wedding?
Let's see, I should remember.
I think
19th.
November the 19th.
19th.
He and Lynn were married. and kind of tied the knot officially, if you will. There they are there. And right there is Chris, one of their sons. How old is Chris?
He's 8.
He's 8. Chris, it's nice to have you here. And it was a pleasure to meet you. This is kind of great because we had talked about you when your dad was here before. It's just terrific to see you, and I can hope, and I probably know, in fact, that what we've talked about today are going to be words of encouragement to many, many parents and youngsters as well. Thanks, Brian, for being here. Steve,
thank you, Gary. Good to see you.
We'll return in just a moment.